This is a fresh piece of Fabriano Artistico traditional white cold pressed paper. It's 140 pound. I have it taped down with a 3/4 inch masking tape, and I have it on a board. This board is just, it's actually a board that makes signs out of, but you can buy gator boards, you can buy a masonite. There's a lot of things you can tape your paper down to. Just make sure it's something sturdy. And if you can see, I've got it propped up. I put the masking tape under the board, so it's barely elevated on the top edge, which allows the water to kind of run towards me should any water start to pool up on it. That's an important tip. I can't stress that enough. Keep that paper slightly elevated. I'm going to paint a little snow scene here, and we're going to use all four of the basic applications we just talked about: the wet on wet, the dry on wet, wet on dry, and dry on dry. They'll all four be in this exercise. I encourage you to try this exercise numerous times, doing small, and then start working up into larger pieces once you get more comfortable with it. It's a wonderful exercise to really get you started in watercolor and get you familiar with the colors, how to handle the paper, how to handle the brushes, and you'll learn through your mistakes whether it's too wet or too dry or something. So let's see if we can't get this going right now. I'm going to wet the paper down to about probably 3/4 of the way down. I'm going to wet from the top down to about here, so I'll have a nice wet background for a sky. And then we're going to do a wet on wet sky. So let me take a clean brush. I'm just using the one of the bristle brushes to wet this with. Not for any specific reason, it's just handy. So I've got a nice wet area of paper, which will be the sky in this painting. Now let's just take some of the colors I already have on my palette. I've got some of this violet already mixed. I want a nice wet sky. So I use a wet paint. This can be wet on wet. And I can go back and forth and just really put a pretty sky into it. Now while that's wet, let's put some more color into it. Let's take some other color. This is cyan blue, primary blue cyan. Let's see if we can't drop some of that into it. Not covering up all the purple. Let the purples kind of show through in a few places. And we're just putting in a very wet on wet sky. And I'm bringing it right down to the horizon line where I wet the paper. And the paper's slightly tilted. The paint's starting to run just a little bit. It gets this really beautiful, kind of a drizzly type look in the sky, which I find quite attractive. It's one of the first things that attract me to this stuff. Now, there's a lot of paint building, a lot of water building up along the edge. It's a good idea to go along with the Kleenex and get that off, because what's going to happen is that water will eventually start to leach back into your painting, and you get a blossom all the way around the edge of your painting if you don't get that water off. So we're going to just take a second and wipe that off. And again, these are little tips that I learned the hard way. So if I can save you some aggravating moments, I certainly want to. So now I've got a nice clean edge and get this nice drizzly sky. Now if I wanted to, I could tilt this towards me and the paint's going to run even more. But I think for this demonstration, that's as much as I need just to really illustrate a sky. And there's even some white areas which look like little wispy clouds off in the distance. So we know this is very, very wet paper because it's still got a very high shine on it, so the water is still sitting on the surface of the paper. In a few minutes, that water can start being soaked into the paper. It'll start getting more of a dull finish on the surface. Then I'm going to come in and put some background trees using the bristle brush and a dry paint. Remember, a dry paint has very, very little water in it. So you still get a soft edge, but it's not introducing water into your paper. So while I'm waiting for that to kind of soak in a little bit, let's take this medium-sized bristle brush and let's come over the palette and mix up some nice, pretty, earthy tones for some background trees. Let's take some of this color, which is called cupric green. Let's take some more of the brown. And let's take some of the violet. And if you notice, these are very, very dry paints. In fact, they almost have too much water in them. Let's get the water out. Make sure they're really good and dry. That's much better. That's real pacey. Remember, I'm looking for something that's very much the consistency of melted butter. Now, it's getting a little bit of a dull finish. So let's go in there real quickly and see if we can't suggest some little background trees. And what we're painting in here is a snow scene. The white paper is actually going to be the snow. So we're just putting all kinds of little things in the background that might suggest a distant horizon with lots of trees. We're going to vary the heights of the trees a little bit. We're also going to vary the colors. Some are a little more brown, some are more in the green. And I'm taking that brush, I'm putting the corner down and just barely touching it, just kind of rolling it in a little bit. From time to time, blot the brush on that blotter. It's important to keep out water out of that brush. Let's put a little bit of violet in it. Again, very, very dry. Make sure it's blotted. Let's put a big one up in there. I teach this little exercise in my workshops, and I have seen some of the most incredible paintings come out of these workshops where people have done this exercise. First couple they do is kind of a hit and miss because they're trying something new, and anytime you try something new, you're going to make mistakes. We all do. But once they get the hang of it, they just do the most incredible little paintings. They're just gorgeous. A lot of them I know are framed up when they get home. So we're learning now how to do a wet on wet sky and a dry on wet row of trees using a little thicker brush with much heavier paint. Now let's see if we can't put a big one right in this area. I want a real big one that's kind of coming into the foreground a little bit. Just to give the painting a little bit more depth. And remember, this is dry paper down here. So since I'm using dry paint and the paper's dry, I'm getting this really pretty dry brush effect, which looks like grass. And you can really sit there and do this all day long. I mean, it's so fun, you don't want to quit. You just want to keep adding more and more trees, but we're going to quit in just a second just for illustration. Now we got a nice little smooth scene kind of evolving out of this. Let's put a few more areas of dry brush. And again, we're just using this dry paint on this dry paper down here, which gives me a nice effect of a little grassy outcropping and it's sticking up out of the snow. And at this point, probably need to stop and dry the paper because all these shapes are wet. The sky is still slightly wet. Even though this is dry, we're going to do some blending down here with the bristle brush. My biggest concern at this point is I don't want to put a wet brush anywhere near these wet shapes because I'll get that blossom, that big background, it'll just take off and ruin the whole painting. So let's wait just a second till these sort of loosen the shine a little bit. I'm going to take a brush handle and scrape in a few tree trunks. Then we'll stop and take a hair dryer and dry the paper. Now a lot of people say you shouldn't use a hair dryer. I couldn't disagree more. I work in a studio and a lot of times I just have to stop and dry the paper. I may go work on the computer for a while or go run some errands while the paper dries. But if I'm really in a painting binge that day and I want to get some pieces done, I'm going to just take out the dryer and dry. It only takes 2 minutes and I'm ready to go on to the next stage. Once the paint has run to the degree you want it to run, which, you know, if you're working wet on wet, for example, and the paint is doing that running thing, once it reaches the point that you're comfortable with it and you want to stop at that point, there's certainly no harm in taking out the hair dryer. So we're going to stop real quick like. Let me put a couple trunks in here real quick using this beveled edge. I'm just taking that edge and kind of just pulling it up, putting in a few tree trunks. And now the piece is ready to dry. It's a very simple little piece.